Hello and welcome to ChatDPS, where this week we are joined by gurus in data protection and data sovereignty, Hayden Delaney and Stephen Hunwicks, who are both from Thomson Geer lawyers. They're based here in Brisbane. Usual contributors from Robert and Adam, as well as myself. And we're looking forward to creating some content today that we'll be using in an event later this month. And if you haven't got your ticket already, do reach out if you're interested in the content today, because it will be relevant to what we're trying to achieve. So what's really going on here is the fact that we want to talk about the new parameters around GRC. Governance, risk, and compliance. Now then, Hayden, I'm going to hand over to you to begin with, because there's some massive changes that have happened just recently and some real reasons that we should be aware of the risks of running without GRC, correct?
Yeah, that's right, Nick. So recently we had some really interesting decisions handed down by two separate regulators in Australia, both in relation to cybersecurity failures, cyber risk failures. The first one being the Australian Clinical Labs decision. That was action taken by the Australian privacy regulator, the OAIC, or the Privacy Commissioner. And then separately to that, we had ASIC, our corporate regulator, taking action against FIG for failures to have adequate cybersecurity measures in place as applicable to financial licensees under the Corporations Act. Both different facts, both interesting and worth going through, but both of them a clear message that Australia's regulators are moving into enforcement territory and that cyber risk is a serious issue that organisations need to consider.
Stephen, do you have anything to add to the fact? I mean, because there's a lot more detail that sits down behind some of these things in terms of where the regulator is pressing and why the reasons for why they're pressing. Can you give us some insight around what's actually going on in that regard?
Yeah, absolutely, Nick. There's a couple of things going on there. The most two notable of which are regulators have moved from an education or awareness phase into their enforcement phase. And this was always part of their regulatory action plan. They are exactly following the playbook they set out. But that was to first check that industry was learning, developing, growing, maturing in their cyber risk and privacy management awareness. And then now that there's been a few years of runway to have that work take effect, the regulators have moved to enforce the existing laws. Now, the backdrop to all this is probably that, over years, Australians have fallen victim to a number of cyber events, cyber scams, and for various, underlying cyber and technical reasons. But we've seen the likes of Optus, Medibank, and some other very public data incidents sitting behind changes to both the Privacy Act to increase penalties, but also really changing the discussion at the board level. We've really amped up the discussion around GRC, cyber risk resilience and preparedness, but also our response capability. So all that is messaging sitting behind the regulatory action. The regulators are simply expecting that businesses are good custodians of the data that they hold, the financial assets they're responsible for.
So this comes back to the compliance sort of straight for people like yourselves, Adam. I mean, what differences are actually being made at this moment in time in the average working day of the CISO? I mean, the CISO is actually sort of there to be the guardian of the data and the guardian of the entity, I suppose, in so many respects. I mean, moving from education into enforcement has got to have an impact.
Absolutely. It's actually interesting. Only in the last couple of years has the role moved into a more strategic role across the board. So for a very long time, governance, risk, and compliance was compliance, tiny bit of risk and assurance with no governance. And now we're starting to get into that strategic governance side of things, where it's starting to get a seat at the table at the boards, and you're starting to think of things strategically and where you're going and how you do whatever your business does safely in the world. So it's only been in the last few years where it's really changed from that. You'll notice now there's a lot of CISOs out there that don't come from technical backgrounds and are doing a great job. Whereas before it was very much that technical role.
Right. So, Robert, I mean, this collaboration in the new world order, what we're beginning to understand is that, sort of You've got legal resources, technical resources, you've got operational resources, you've got, sort of like people at the front end of the business that are now having to sort of like work together, collaborate, and to achieve, I suppose, strategic objectives for an organization. Is that fairer? Or, I mean, is that creating cultural, sort of challenges within an organization, do you think?
Sorry, this is so complicated that it's interesting because there's just so much going on. So from a business perspective, they're all talking about getting AI in, and what does agentic AI mean for their business, and thinking about the bottom line, and how do we sort of move ahead, and how can we cut 1,000 jobs and all this kind of stuff. So there's very much this kind of business driven approach going on, and then at the same time, as Hayden and Stephen have said, we've moved from the regulators saying, hey guys, you need to improve your cyber resilience, and doing this for years, and suddenly it's starting to get real. But whether it's getting real enough in enough sectors to actually shift the dial for the majority of organizations, I think it's going to be still a fairly slow process to get your C-suite, your boards to kind of go, okay, I just need to switch from being focused on, pushing this AI tool through versus, I need to actually improve my GRC. They'll probably be asking, can my cyber insurance respond to this? Can I just pay the ransomware? I know I've got to report it now under the Cybersecurity Act, but are there other ways I can get around this because I want to focus on actually driving the business forward through these new tools that need to be invested in? So there's that kind of push-pull, I think, that's going on in a lot of businesses. But look, I think with each fine and with each message that the regulators come out with, and particularly ASIC have been quite strong about being proactive. Can't just outsource this thing. The more fines come through, and I think there's one coming up soon in relation to fraud and private wealth. So the more of these that happen, we're still waiting to see the outcomes of Optus and Medibank and Latitude and others. I think the more these become visible, the more that'll sort of shift this discussion about collaborating with an organization taking GRC seriously. So it's a slow shift because of these competing forces, but I think it is slowly starting to shift.
So I'd like to examine this thing a little bit deeper in terms of what Adam's actually suggesting, in terms of the fact that, the shift is coming because it used to be a lot of C, a little bit of R, and then the big G was sort of like, which is really what, with respect, I mean, Hayden, Stephen, Robert, yourselves, you all focus in on, right? So there's a maturity problem globally with governance, is my understanding from the research that I've done in the past and the statistics that I've been able to sort of like look at and the reports that we've read. I mean, from a Thomson Geer perspective to begin with, governance going forward, are you guys doing anything differently now to what you were doing maybe, a couple of years ago?
Absolutely. So, I mean, there's legal force behind that. The Privacy Act itself, and Australian Privacy Principle 11, that's been reformed very recently. And as part of those reforms, it was noted that reasonable steps is not just technical measures, it's technical and organizational measures. So that recognition that the people component, the governance component, is a really key essential part to good cyber risk management. The law recognizes that. And in terms of what we're seeing an increasing desire to get in front of things, not just wait for a regulator to come knocking, but being able to proactively demonstrate within your organization that you're taking reasonable steps, not just technically, not just putting some fancy new kit in and saying everything's done, but making sure that there is that governance in place, that there's that muscle memory in place within your organization to be able to demonstrate reasonable steps if you're called to do it. So we're looking to get proactive about this. We're looking to make sure that we take the lessons from some of these cases, like the Australian Clinical Labs, or like some other like the other decision and figure, making sure we're learning those lessons and being proactive.
Stephen, and anything from you to back that up? Obviously, I mean, listening to Hayden, there's a whole new agenda that's going through corporate Australia at this moment in time, and it's about the regulators are now apportioning blame. they're actually taking these cases and they're actually executing those cases. So, I mean, are you doing more training on site? Are corporates, are the corporations actually looking to you and saying, hey guys, can you come in and actually give us an oversight? Or are you doing something a little bit different?
It's a bit of a mix, Nick, and it is all of those things. So on the one hand, boards are really wanting an opinion, both from a legal and a technical perspective, about whether the measures they've taken, both at the technical level, the people level, the funding level, and the governance level, would stack up to regulatory scrutiny. So you can have a technical combined with a legal opinion that really assesses whether the steps you've taken would pass muster if, as I say, the regulator comes knocking. Part of that story that you need to tell to the regulator involves having a well-documented history of the steps you've taken. So another thing that organizations are doing is actually starting to record and manage, almost in a librarian or historian style, the steps they've taken over time. They're not just looking back, what are we doing this quarter? They're actually developing a chronology of those activities over time, so that when the regulator comes, they can say, actually, we had advice 3 years ago from an outside expert that said put in place these new measures, whether it was upgraded firewalls, just as an example. That was 3 years ago. 2 years ago, our program was uplift in these areas of resilience. Last year, we focused on policies. These are just examples, but the point is that they're setting a program, they're taking steps to resource and action that program, and then they're documenting the success of the program and how it impacts their risk appetite as well as their risk preparedness. They're having a story to tell the regulator.
Yeah, that's what a mature organization is looking to do. Yes, you can go and get, obviously insurance, which will help cover off the financial risks to a degree of a cyber incident. But we know when these incidents happen, it's so much more than just the money. Reputation is everything, and being able to get ahead of the risk and look at it not just in terms of, well, I get compensation from my insurer, looking to get ahead of it, make sure that you have that documented evidence in place of the steps that you've taken at a governance level will, I think, be so much more effective in the longer term.
It's a really good point that you're making there, but I'd like to sort of like do a sharp right turn, if I can, and hand back to Adam a little bit. Adam, these things go in cycles. So what Hayden, Stephen, and Robert are all intimating here is the fact that, you've got to have some consistency around things. But from an internal technology and tooling perspective, what we're beginning to see is the fact that there's hot topics, One of the big hot topics from my perspective at this moment in time appears to be API security. And it's because nobody has actually really done very much about API security in recent years, I'm guessing. Have you got a perspective around that?
Yep. So API is the hot topic on everyone's list at the moment. I like to think a little more abstract or slightly higher level. The reason why APIs are such a problem is because of the old authentication issue, right? We're back to, who are you? Are you the right person? Do you have access to the right data, right? So we've made all of these APIs. They all talk to each other. They get different ideas. And what I find interesting about all of this is the most common API attacks that are out there, they're not genius hacks or things you'll find in movies, right? It's basically the equivalent of having a hotel key card that opens all the rooms, not just your room. And that's the unfortunate failure with this whole thing is you log in as you, right? But the API, if it has access to something else, if you ask it the right way or in a nice way, it'll just give you whatever it has access to.
So, Robert, these APIs, they're talking to all systems everywhere, all of the time. And what Adam's saying is, hey, guys, sort of like, I've got this great key and it's just going, I can get into whatever room I want. And I can take whatever information I want in order to be able to collate the piece that I want at any given time, I guess. I mean, how scary is that from a regulatory perspective?
I think it's very scary, isn't it? And I think, we've seen in terms of software architecture models over the years, software vendors are wanting to try, where possible, to make their applications interoperable, to work together as part of a system. That's obviously something customers have been asking for some time, so they've gone and done that. But then that in turn creates this whole new set of supply chain risk, because these systems are all connected in such an intricate spider web-like way. It becomes a whole new problem that needs to be considered. And I think good hygiene, get to the basics like Adam was talking about. Think about authentication. Is this who the person who I think it actually is? Putting those basics in and saying, looking back in time and amongst all the desire to make everything interoperable, and just think, have these basics, these hygiene factors been applied across my web of applications that interconnect?
Hayden and Stephen, can I add a bit of fuel to the fire here and get your opinion on something? There's a bugbear I have with my own industry, right? When it comes to APIs, if you have dealt with any companies that do monitoring of systems, they will tell you, security firms will tell you, oh, that API, it's really chatty, super expensive, probably not security information anyway. Don't look at it. Which happens a lot, unfortunately. So from your perspective as lawyers, right? I know these days from working with cyber insurance on this side of the fence, when they can see that you've got gaps that you know about, then they become void from your policy perspective. So if something was to happen, they're not going to pay out anyway. But it would be interesting to hear your understanding of that or what you feel about it.
Couple of good pieces there, Adam. Thanks. And that's a good tale from the trenches, as it were. There's often an argument that insurers are trying not to pay out. And there may be some truth to that, of course. But we see both insurers and regulators picking up on situations where businesses have had advice from internal or external experts, then failed to implement that advice. And that's what the regulators and the insurers pick up on.
It's that lack of knowledge that's a real factor that undoes people. It's not rather not the lack of knowledge, but the positive knowledge that you have these problems in your ecosystem and you're not doing something about it. That's a real factor.
So when we look at Australian Clinical Labs, we find a scenario where the company did due diligence. It identified security vulnerabilities in the systems of the target company. It onboarded the company, brought those problems in with it, and failed to act on them before they suffered a cyber incident. Yeah. If we look at FIG Securities, they had expert advice from several external sources that said, here are the vulnerabilities in your system, fix them. No action taken, or insufficient funding and resourcing putting behind the actions they were intending and trying to take.
That's right. And these are the problems. FIG had the technical tools that generated the alerts. They knew something was going on. The tools were working. There just wasn't the people power there to manage those alerts as generated and to respond in a timely way to otherwise rectify the incident before it really became as bad as it was in that particular case.
But Nick, this is the API conversation is, in my mind, a thematic example of supply chain risk. The APIs are fundamentally about connecting elements in a supply chain into a common system with data exchanges and interactions. And if we don't manage our APIs well, we have supply chain risk issues.
Yeah, Robert, I know for months and months and months now, we've been talking about supply chain risk and what have you. I mean, your opportunity to beat the drum again, I guess.
Yeah, well, I'll come back to one of those sort of themes, which is you got to think about what business you're in and what resources you have and what information, what data you hold. And it might be that API risk is when you do proper risk management, when you actually go through a proper exercise of identifying all of those things I've said, which sector you're in, and go through and go, okay, what are my issues? So it might be API risk because you rely heavily on the use of APIs and you've got to actually do your due diligence on your supply chain. But it might be that your business is much more simple and actually it's business email compromise is your biggest risk, and phishing and vishing and all those sorts of things. So you've really got to do that analysis and then figure out, okay, here are our key risks, and it's got to be at that C-suite and board level, and sit down and go, okay, well now we're going to put some resources to these risks, and here are the mitigations we're going to put in place. Here are the controls we're going to put in place. and this is how we're going to work through these issues. That's a mature level conversation, which I think the majority of businesses probably don't have, because don't forget, 95% of businesses in Australia are SMEs, and a lot of them will just be signing up to the Microsoft suite of products, and they'll be going with the default settings. So there's a big education piece in here to actually go, look at your business risk, look at your resources, look at your sector, look at your data, and actually identify where your vulnerabilities are and start to take action.
Nick, can I pick up on Robert's comment there and just say the threshold for adequate measures, reasonable steps, the other words and phrases that are used in the Australian legislation, it doesn't set a bar of do absolutely everything at all costs and you must avoid a cyber incident. It's reasonable steps. So exactly to Robert's point, you need to do the analysis to figure out what's your risk appetite and your risk exposure, and then put adequate resources, reasonable steps against those identified risks. If you can do that, you'll meet the regulatory expectation.
That's right.
It also means that you can take stepwise measured, calculated risk assessments and steps to remove those.
I think, Steve, that's something, people often talk with legal issues. Oh, there's no clear answer. There's no A, B, C, do this and you're done.
True.
Type thing. That's it can be frustrating, but it's also the good part of the law is it takes into account the individual circumstances. That what is reasonable to one organisation is not reasonable to the other. If you're an SME, you're not the same as CBA, so we can't impose a one size fits all here. Correct. Different organisations have different standards, different threats, different resources.
Interesting, and I think that was really insightful around the sort of like you've got to get this bit. You've got to do something. Yeah. If you're seen to be doing something, then that's right. Tacking back to the left again, because I'm really good at that. The objective here, again, going back to collaboration, I think, is desktop exercises. Where do these things actually fit in? Because if you go into any organization, I mean, this is part of the ability to actually say, well, we've actually tried it, we've tested it, we've gone through some things here. We've actually asked some deep, reasonable questions. Should every organization, what's the legislation now saying, above $3 million turnover or something, should every organization have that conversation with itself, do you think?
Look, I think that doing those desktop or tabletop exercises is a great way, but a great way to demonstrate proactively reasonable steps at an organizational level. It's like training for a marathon. You can't just go and run the marathon if the incident is the marathon. You can't just go and run it without any training or preparation. You've got to get that muscle memory in place at an organizational level, and being able to demonstrate a documented history of conducting these tabletop exercises, if questioned by a regulator because something has happened, is a really good way to demonstrate those organizational reasonable steps.
And if we continue that team analogy, a marathon is a team sport when done in a business context.
Yeah.
The desktop exercises really help us in a safe way to have conversations with our peers, whether that's at the operational, the senior leader, the board level. We get to practice alongside our peers for a marathon cyber incident or regulatory investigation. And in our experience, these things have 2-year timeframes. A breach happens and you might be back up and running, and people might be back to their day jobs within 6 months. But it really takes another 18 months beyond that to really put in place some of the uplift that you probably should have had in the first place, and to satisfy a regulator that things are back where they should be.
Right. And I'm just sort of like trying to, I suppose, labor a point around the collaboration piece. What I'm thinking here is that is across the business. Yeah. So you need to know what the front end users are, what the back end people are doing, what strategically the business is, how it views things. And those tabletop and desktop exercises sort of like highlight the fact that you can literally pull a paper copy off the shelf, so that because you don't want to be doing that with your systems are down, right? Or compromised. Yeah, you want a paper copy up on the top of the shelf. Have you run some really good or been involved in some really good ones yourself?
Yes, absolutely. Do you know there's a common theme, though, of steps that are difficult in the beginning for all businesses. And the first one is, believe it or not, the communication between the business. Knowing the right person to contact, who to talk to, who's able to help, who's able to approve. That simple test of the communications between everything, all the way through to who gives the go ahead to speak to the media, and do you even have anyone who's media trained? And all of these things come out. It's really interesting that the technical side doesn't come out until like your fourth or fifth go.
Right.
So,
Okay.
yeah.
There's a piece for you. That's nice bit of insight. So guys, I guess one eye on the time. I'd like everybody to give us, sort of like in the current environment, what's the one thing that you would say you've got to do this, because if you don't do this, you're kind of dead in the water, or just this one piece of advice that I was given was just golden for me. I mean, Hayden, would you like to start that route?
Yeah, sure. So I think if I could just leave people with one thing, is think about the preparation. Don't just leave it to a response. Being able to demonstrate proactively what you've done, be it tabletop exercises or other things, in advance of an incident occurring. Us as the lawyers are helping respond to a regulator who's looking at taking action. If we can put forward this nice documented suite of steps that have been taken proactively, it may make the difference between a regulator deciding to investigate or making a decision, actually, this fight's a bit too hard, I've got other targets to go after. So I think that's a really important one to think about and easy to do.
Excellent. Stephen, have you got something else that you might throw into the hat, throw into the ring?
I'm going to be a bit brave on this one and say something that may be un-Australian. Cyber is not a time when we can afford to put to one side difficult conversations. We need to have difficult conversations with our peers at all levels about cyber risk and what we're doing about it. So my suggestion to everyone is, please don't put that too hard conversation back on the shelf.
Perfect. That's a really, really good one. Robert, I know you've always got a couple of words of wisdom.
We often distill things down to people, process, technology as the three kind of broad areas to look at. I'll give a shout out to people as a takeaway. Often forgotten, the cause of many breaches, unfortunately. And it's a cultural thing. So really think about not just tick and flick awareness training, but to really embed cyber resilience, cyber awareness into the culture of the organization. That'll be my takeaway.
Perfect. And Adam, different perspectives, mate.
Last one for me then, I suppose, is just remember to stay and get back to basics. The biggest piece of advice I ever got was security isn't confidential in your business. We all have the same NDA. Stop hiding everything and have free conversations about what's actually going on.
Great advice. Great people. Hayden, Stephen, Robert, Adam. What a great conversation. Thank you so much for all of your input today. And I'm really looking forward to looking at this event that we're running a little bit later this month. And hopefully there's some really good nuggets in there that we can all take into that and have a great day. That was ChatDPS for this week, a special edition with Thomson Geer Lawyers. We thank you very much. Cheerio.
Bye now.
Thank you.
Thank you.